When you observe a narcissist in full form, boasting, posturing, asserting dominance in conversation, it's easy to mistake their behavior for real confidence. And that's precisely the point. Because what you're seeing isn't strength, it's not confidence, it's camouflage. It's an elaborate defense mechanism, carefully assembled over years, designed to distract both themselves and others from something far more uncomfortable: the deep sense of inadequacy, fear, and inner chaos they carry within. Now let's think about what confidence actually is. True confidence doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be inflated or constantly validated. It simply exists. It manifests as calm, grounded self-assurance. But narcissistic grandiosity is something different entirely. It's not rooted in inner stability. It's a reaction to inner instinct. It's a desperate attempt to create an identity that appears invulnerable precisely because the person wearing it feels intensely vulnerable underneath. This is the paradox. The more grandiose the narcissist, the more fragile the self beneath it. The louder the ego, the more insecure the identity that drives it. What makes this so psychologically complex is that narcissists often believe their own performance. They've lived inside that false identity for so long that they start to internalize it. But deep down, beneath all the inflated stories and the curated self-image, they live in fear of being found out, exposed. They dread the moment when someone sees through the facade and confronts the childlike fragility they've buried under layers of manipulation and bravado. This kind of defense structure doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It usually forms early in life, often in response to shame, neglect, or emotional invalidation. In childhood, when a person isn't affirmed for who they truly are, they sometimes build a mask to survive. They invent a superior version of themselves that's immune to pain, immune to rejection. And over time, that invented version becomes their only reality. They no longer know how to connect authentically because the false self has taken over the real one. So what happens when you, perhaps as an empath or simply as someone who sees with clarity, begin to pierce that illusion? When you stop feeding their need for admiration, when you don't respond to their attempts to provoke envy, fear, or guilt, they panic because their entire identity is built on reflection. It only exists in the reactions of others. If you stop reflecting their false self back to them, if you stop being an emotional mirror to their ego, they start to unravel. You begin to see what's underneath, and so do they. And that, for a narcissist, is terrifying. That's the moment their mask begins to crack. Here's where we need to exercise some caution, not for them, but for ourselves. Because when the mask cracks, the narcissist will often lash out. Not just because they're angry, but because they're terrified. And fear, in someone who is emotionally unequipped to process it, often expresses itself as emotionally unequipped to process it. So know that you are in fear, because sometimes the most emotionally unequipped to process it often expresses itself as emotionally unequipped to process it. This is the secret to fear, is that the moment uncertainty is cruelty. It's not excusable, but it is understandable. You're seeing a person whose identity is disintegrating and who will do almost anything to prevent that collapse. But here's the truth you must hold on to. That grandiosity, that performance, that superiority complex, it's not a reflection of your weakness. It's a desperate cover-up of theirs. When a narcissist tries to make you feel small, it's because they already feel microscopic inside. When they try to dominate a room, it's because they don't believe they matter unless everyone else submits. This is the psychological equation they live by. Control equals safety. Dominance equals worth. You don't need to participate in that equation. You don't need to play a role in their illusion. You don't need to believe the story they're selling, because it's not just untrue, it's unsustainable. No one can maintain a false self forever. Eventually, the performance breaks, and when it does, what's revealed isn't a monster, but a wounded human being who never learned how to be real, because the truth of who they were never felt like it was enough. That doesn't mean you can fix them. In fact, trying to do so will only entangle you further in their dysfunction. Your job is not to rescue the narcissist from their pain. Your job is to protect your peace, your clarity, your self-worth. To recognize that your silence, your boundary, your refusal to engage in their emotional theater, that is a mirror they cannot control, and it frightens them more than anything else. So the next time you're confronted with narcissistic grandiosity, remind yourself, this is not power. This is pain in costume. This is fear acting as arrogance. This is a desperate cry for significance from someone who has never felt truly seen, and you, by seeing through it, have already taken the first step toward reclaiming your power. The strength to walk away from illusion is greater than the effort to sustain it. You don't need to match their performance. You just need to remain real. And in a world full of masks, nothing is more threatening to a narcissist than the truth. One of the most psychologically deceptive tactics a narcissist employs is projection. Now, projection is not merely a tactic they consciously use. It's a deeply ingrained defense mechanism, something they almost do instinctively. It's their escape hatch, their emergency exit, when reality threatens the illusion they've constructed around themselves. Here's the fundamental principle. The narcissist cannot tolerate the idea that they are flawed. It's not just uncomfortable, it's existentially threatening. Admitting guilt or responsibility means confronting shame. And shame is something the narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. It would mean facing the truth that they are not as superior, not as in control, not as admired as they need to believe. So instead, when they hurt you, when they lie, betray, manipulate, they take the guilt they should carry and hand it to you. You made me do this. You're too sensitive. You always overreact. You become the villain in a story that they authored. What's crucial to understand is that this isn't always a deliberate lie. Often, they genuinely believe it. They feel persecuted. They feel attacked. The narcissist's emotional landscape is so disordered that they interpret boundaries as betrayal, honesty as criticism, and your pain as manipulation. It's a total inversion of emotional logic. And when you're caught in that inversion, it can be disorienting. You start questioning yourself. Did I really provoke that reaction? Was I being too harsh? Maybe I am the problem. That's the trap. Projection isn't just about blame shifting. It's a mechanism that turns the victim into the aggressor and the aggressor into the misunderstood martyr. It's not only a psychological maneuver to protect their own ego, it's also a method of control. If they can get you to believe that you are the unstable one, the one who needs fixing, then you'll stay. You'll keep proving your loyalty. You'll apologize for things you never did, and they'll never have to change. This is why projection is so damaging. It rewrites the narrative of abuse. It clouds clarity with confusion. And worst of all, it weaponizes your empathy. Because if you're someone with a deep capacity for self-reflection, which most empaths are, then you're vulnerable to this manipulation. Narcissists don't project onto people who won't care. They target the ones who do. Because caring people try to understand. They try to find common ground. And the narcissist exploits that compassion, turning your self-reflection against you. So what do? When you realize you've been a projection screen? for someone else's shame. First, you reclaim your narrative. You go back to the facts. Not the story you were fed, but the actual events. What was said, what was done, how it made you feel. You begin to separate their version of reality from your own, because clarity is the first step toward freedom. Second, you begin to create space. Not just physical space, although that may be necessary, but emotional and mental space. You stop defending yourself against accusations that were never true to begin with. You stop arguing with someone who needs to be right more than they need to be honest. You start preserving your energy for truth, not illusion. Third, you let go of the need for justice from the narcissist. And this is hard, because part of you wants them to see what they did, to admit it, to apologize. But the very structure of their psyche is built to avoid that reckoning. Waiting for a narcissist to take responsibility is like waiting for a mirror to reflect something it refuses to see. It's futile. Your healing cannot depend on their admission of guilt. It must be rooted in your own recognition of what is real. And perhaps most importantly, you learn to trust yourself again. Because projection damages more than relationships. It damages intuition. It causes you to second guess your feelings, your perceptions, your instincts. But with time and truth, that inner compass can be recalibrated. And when it is, you no longer need someone else's version of events to validate your own experience. You see, when a narcissist projects, what they're really doing is revealing the parts of themselves they're most ashamed of. When they accuse you of being manipulative, it's often because they are. When they say you're selfish, it's because they can't admit how self-centered they've become. And when they say you're the one causing the pain, it's because they've long ago severed the connection between action and consequence in their own mind. Recognizing projection for what it is allows you to step out of the emotional labyrinth they've trapped you in. It doesn't make the pain disappear, but it gives you something far more valuable: clarity. And clarity is the foundation of healing. It's one of the most disorienting experiences in a relationship with a narcissist, the illusion of connection. They seem so present in the beginning, so attentive, so deeply attuned to your emotions, your thoughts, your fears. They say the right words, mimic the right expressions, mirror your values. And at first glance, it feels like something meaningful is unfolding. You believe you've met someone who truly sees you. But here's the psychological paradox. Narcissists don't actually feel what they reflect. What they perform is empathy without empathy's substance. It's a mask, a simulation. Because genuine empathy, true compassion, is rooted in vulnerability. And vulnerability requires the courage to confront one's own limitations, one's own darkness. That's something a narcissist avoids at all costs. The mirroring is calculated, not always consciously, but deeply wired into their relational instincts. They watch how you express your emotions. They study what makes you feel seen and validated, and then they replicate it. Not to bind with you authentically, but to bind you to them. It's seduction disguised as understanding, and it's powerful. Because for someone with a deep capacity for connection, that mirroring can feel like love. It can feel like destiny. But over time, something starts to feel off. You notice inconsistencies, moments where they seem cold when you need comfort, indifference when you're in pain. They say the right words, but they land flat, like an actor reading lines from a script they don't believe. And eventually, you come to a startling realization. They're not connecting with you. They're performing you. They're using your own emotional blueprint to create a version of themselves that you'll accept, admire, and most importantly, need. This illusion serves a purpose. It keeps you hooked. It bypasses your defenses. It creates the impression of intimacy without requiring the vulnerability intimacy demands. And the longer you stay, the more you invest, the more you'll try to explain away the gaps. You'll tell yourself they're just stressed or tired or misunderstood, because to admit that the connection isn't real, that it never was real, feels like an unbearable betrayal. But this is where clarity must rise. Because the moment you realize that you were relating to a reflection rather than a reality is the moment you begin to reclaim your authenticity. The narcissist's false empathy begins to unravel under scrutiny. Their responses become formulaic. Their reactions become defensive. They can't sustain the illusion forever because there's no emotional reservoir behind it. It's all surface. Now, this isn't to say narcissists feel nothing. They feel anger, they feel envy, they feel fear, but they struggle profoundly with the emotions that create deep human bonds: guilt, remorse, awe, gratitude. These emotions require a stable sense of self. They require inner coherence. And for the narcissist, the self is fragmented, built on grandiosity and shame rather than wholeness. So rather than developing true empathy, they develop strategies, tools of influence, imitation, manipulation. This is what makes healing from a relationship with a narcissist so difficult. You weren't only betrayed, you were deceived on a level that touches the core of your humanity. You offered your empathy, and it was weaponized. You gave your trust, and it was mirrored back as a mask. And the pain of that, of realizing that what felt sacred was, to them, strategic, can leave scars that are more psychological than emotional. It's not just heartbreak, it's identity break. But here's the deeper truth. Your ability to feel, to care, to connect, it's not your weakness. It's your greatest strength. And the narcissist saw that. They didn't mirror your empathy because they possessed it. They mirrored it because they lacked it, and they needed yours to survive emotionally. Your empathy was the light in their darkness. The mirror they held up wasn't meant to honor you. It was meant to borrow your light so they didn't have to confront the void within themselves. When you finally see this, when you stop chasing the ghost of who you thought they were, you begin to reclaim what is real, your own emotional truth. You realize that the connection you longed for was never in them, it was always in you. The longing to be seen, understood, loved, that came from your heart, your soul, your depth. And that depth is something they could never touch, only imitate. And so your healing begins when the illusion ends. When you stop asking, why couldn't they love me the way I loved them? And start affirming, I loved, I gave, I felt, and that was real. Because while they may move on to mirror someone else, to perform connection again with another unsuspecting heart, they will remain trapped in that performance, always acting, never becoming, always imitating, never evolving. But you have something they don't: the ability to grow, the capacity to transform pain into purpose. And that, ultimately, is what separates the authentic from the counterfeit. Let that truth anchor you. Let it remind you that even when love is exploited, it is never wasted. Because real love, real empathy, doesn't vanish when it's not returned. It becomes wisdom, it becomes power, and it becomes the light that leads you home.